everyone, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host, Dan. Today is Saturday, May 17th, and I'm doing a video for Uranus Cazimi, which is taking place tomorrow, May 18th. It will be followed by Mercury conjunct Uranus in Taurus on May the 24th, and then a Mercury Cazimi on June 1st. Also, this is all happening between now and the end of the month. I'm focusing on, in this video, to keep things topically concise. I'm focusing on these transits that are happening in the sign of Taurus, featuring Mercury and Uranus. But there's also going to be Saturn ingressing into Aries on May 25th, which is perhaps one of the most major transits of the year. And you'll have to stay tuned for another video on that topic. Although I have done some forecasting, some videos already on this Saturn-Neptune and Aries transit that we're having. But for now, today, what I'm focusing on is the Uranus Cazimi, which is happening tomorrow. And for one thing, this is different. My last video I did was about the full moon. And I think doing Cazimi videos always feel a little bit different because Cazimi is something that is an idea from traditional astrology that is just not as popular as full moons and lunations are, and eclipses and all that. A Cazimi is when any planet conjoins the sun, basically. You could also just say Uranus conjunct sun, but a Cazimi has more of a significant meaning because in the way that you have a lunation cycle, which is so popular in terms of astrology videos. Everybody loves, you get so much more clicks for doing a full moon and a new moon, but essentially if you apply that same concept to all the other planets, it's basically the same idea, that you have these cycles, that you have a kind of it's similar to a new moon basically, right? Where a new moon is the moon conjunct the sun. This is like the same idea, but with the planet Uranus, right? So I think this is a prime opportunity to get into the archetype of Uranus, the archetype of Taurus, what that means. And I was just writing this list before starting to record about the different things happening in current events that goes with this, that I think there may be more things happening as we go through this Uranus Cazimi, but already we've got a lot to work with. So first of all, because Taurus typically has to do with, it's a Venus-ruled sign that typically has to do with things like resources, and it's an earth sign, there's an obvious thing happening here with the rare earths, raw minerals, and the tech industry, right? That economically, there is a lot of speculation going on right now about AI or technological advancements of all sorts of different kinds. And there's a sort of material basis for the tech industry in terms of computer chips and batteries, lithium for batteries, all that kind of stuff. And there's, in the midst of geopolitical crisis, such as what has been happening in the land of my ancestors, nonetheless, because I have both Ukrainian and Russian ancestry. So it is like I have to watch terrible war and basically feeling like I've got ancestors on both sides and awful things happening with, I don't even know, I'm just grateful my family immigrated here to Canada and I get to live the life of a peaceful pacifist and don't feel compelled to go and fight, one side of my ancestry versus the other, or whatever, right? But so this is the thing, is that the Ukrainians have apparently made a deal with Trump guaranteeing them some kind of access to raw minerals in exchange for American reinforcement against Russia and obviously there's this basic premise that people have that wars are generally more often than not somehow over wealth and resources than anything else. And the Ukraine is a key kind of resource production or a geopolitical, it's like having a position on the map when you're playing Risk or something, right? I'm going to just give a disclaimer here. I'm not claiming to give you guys any advanced, I don't want to be a political pundit, and there's probably other people that are more well qualified for that job, but I am basically trying to relate to you from an astrological perspective the most obvious things going on, right? And I'll just run through some of them. There's also this kind of thing about Uranus and the rebel, the protester, and stuff like that. And we recently had in the news Ben from Ben and Jerry's, the American ice cream company, got arrested protesting. I think that works with this Uranus and Taurus really well, because I think there's a definite, if you want easy Taurus signifiers, food stuff, right? And you got Ben and Jerry's is like an ice cream product. It's made out of cow's milk. You've got sweet treat, dairy product. You've got the bull, Taurus, the horns. You've got Uranus, the rebel. You've got Ben and Jerry's protesting. There you go. What more do you want, right? That's some great Sun, Uranus, Cazimi protesting, dramatic action happening. You could also see other kinds of shocks and disturbances and disruptions around the topic of resource management, or managing wealth and resources. And for me, this is the most obvious, because I am a Canadian citizen, and in the aftermath of the recent election, we have the province of Alberta right now having a sort of uprising of separatist sentiment. And unfortunately, this is actually a really interesting one to see play out, because I think, especially when we're talking about the Uranus archetype, there's something, I think that the Uranus archetype, for one thing, makes a lot of sense with what happened with Zelensky, because there is the idea of technological change, technological disruption, and that there's a shift around of people squabbling over oil and gas resources, and the idea of Prometheus, Uranus Prometheus as the gift of foresight, looking ahead into the future and understanding maybe a shift away from oil and gas towards things like lithium batteries or different kinds of rare earths and minerals. And there's a very kind of future forward kind of the idea of shifting where your resources are going to be, for one thing, right? And of thinking about things like AI. What Uranus is going to be going into Gemini, and maybe once we get into this Uranus and Gemini, it will be more about the actual software rather than the hardware. But I think there's something about this Uranus and Taurus transiting into Uranus and Gemini, where this part of the cycle, before we get to that part, is consolidating some of the material resource issues that are going to go into the next generation of technological development. So I think that's really obvious, right? And then there's another issue, though, is there's this sort of panic about the shift away from an oil and gas economy. And here in Canada, a lot of our economy is based around Alberta's oil and gas industry, and providing a lot of oil, crude oil to America. And there's big drama around the trade war. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in order to deal with the trade war problem, we want all of our provinces to kind of work together strategically. But because Alberta is more tied in with the American oil and gas industry than all the other provinces, Alberta doesn't want to really... Daniel Smith and Alberta have been kind of playing difficult about the whole issue about the oil and gas industry and where their loyalties lie with that. And Daniel Smith going down to America to these Breitbart conferences and things like that, right? It has raised another issue, though, which I think actually really goes with this Uranus stuff, in that the Alberta separatist movement is being challenged by the Alberta Indigenous First Nations population, because the basic premise is that there's a sort of, and this is interesting because there's a lot of talk about, let's say, I have been for, I should also acknowledge that I've seen certain commentators, certain political people on the internet talk about the problem about the woke, anti-woke dialectic and making things about wokeness or whatever, and it's not that there isn't any substantial issue there, but rather that it's often used as a kind of distraction away from more important issues. But in this particular instance, there's something about it where you have to, I think, get into the real particulars about bioregional identity or colonial identity, that kind of stuff, or the difference of being, for me, it's like the difference of being a Canadian citizen versus an American citizen, because in that whole context, the idea of wokeness, I feel, is very much tied in with Black Lives Matter, what's happening in America, that kind of stuff. And in Canada, the idea of, let's say, racial identity politics is more focused on Indigenous issues, because, I mean, I grew up, I knew lots of Indigenous kids, but there's maybe only, like, in a high school there's like barely any, there's not very many black people in Canada compared to, like, knowing lots of Indigenous people, basically, right? It's just sort of like your social environment is going to just be more colored by Indigenous people or different kinds of immigrants, and it's just a different kind of dynamic. And so the conversation tends to, like, have Indigenous people being more of the center of gravity around that conversation. And a lot of this has to do with the treaties that are signed to sign over the land to the crown in Canada. And so there's this whole kind of idea that if our whole sovereignty is challenged by the United States, the Indigenous and the Albertans don't want their oil and gas industry to be used in the bargaining with the United States, and they want to separate off and have the Indigenous people don't want this to happen because, or not, they legally don't think the Alberta government has the right to even vote on it, basically, because Alberta wants to open up the gate to have a referendum if necessary. The Indigenous people say that it's basically their land, their oil, and if that Albertans want to separate from Alberta, the best thing that you could do would be to try to move to, they could be like Donald Trump is taking in refugees from South Africa, apparently, that Donald Trump could take in the refugees from the oil and gas. You got a bunch of people that are trained to work in the oil and gas industry. They could all go down to Texas and leave, the Indigenous people get to keep the oil and gas, the tar sands for themselves, basically, because the treaty's never been signed, right? And so this is like one of the interesting things about this is that I have this book, The Dawn of Everything, that I've been reading, which makes this argument. I always just thought that there's something about how people understand these archetypes in astrology, and leading into the election, I was looking at what other astrologers were saying about, let's say, Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre and stuff like that, and I found some website about Canadian, I don't know, some Canadian astrologer. This is the first person who came up when I Googled this stuff. And one of the things that I noticed that kind of irked me about that astrologer's perspective on the planet Uranus, I have to admit, I guess it's just a reminder that I think that it's like the planets are outside of the realm of human politics. And I was kind of insinuating maybe that Neptune was a communist planet, because if you look at when the Russian Revolution happened or when the end of communist Russia happened, it was around these Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, right? But there's this thing where people are making this like hard association, it seems, with Uranus and like right-wing tech bro libertarianism, right? And that this idea that for some reason you can just see the sort of like assemblage, I guess you would say. I have to admit, I'm a bit of a different kind of astrologer because I like Deleuze and Guattari. I embrace deconstructionist attitudes, right? And you could take a look at the assemblage of the Uranus archetype, and that people kind of build these things where they're starting to make these hard associations that technological development is inherently something that is capitalist, something that is libertarian or something like that, or that is all right-wing coded, right? And that I think there's some kind of issue here in that you don't want to get stuck looking at the archetype of Uranus typically that in that limited way. And I think for one thing, this book is interesting. There's nothing really directly about astrology in here, well, at least so far. But there's this idea of the Western Enlightenment, right? And the idea here that a lot of what happened with the Enlightenment happened around the kind of cultural relativity that happened once colonial settlers started having more contact with indigenous populations and starting to see that there were their way of doing things was increasingly relativized by the evidence of other cultures who did things differently, introducing a kind of cultural relativism into the situation. And the fact that other cultures could live without a monarchy, without a king, or without the same kind of hierarchy happened at the same time when they started finding things like Plato, right? They started finding, for the longest time, one of the things that influenced the Renaissance was that they didn't actually have access to Plato for a long time, right? They had Aristotle, but they didn't have Plato. And there was this kind of reinterest of the return to Greece, of both a simultaneous encounter of indigenous people, as well as the return to Greece, and then going back to, this gave the grounds for ideas such as democracy to be popular in the first place, because obviously Greece and then Rome, before Rome became taken over by the Caesars, became an empire, there was this period of ancient democracy, right? And it was the combination of the going back and finding this old classic Greek literature, as well as having contact with different cultures who organized their society differently, that inspired revolutionary thinking that we associate with the archetype of Uranus, right? But there's something about this where the freedom associated with, the liberation associated with Uranus isn't just about being, having some sort of technological proficiency, because, I mean, that could just be the, we've invented guns so we can kill people and take their land, and now we can be little kings, and we can, there's something about this where there's a, out of this whole kind of thing comes this sort of protest movement, or this kind of rebellion against the people who took the land, or who are claiming the resources of the land for their own profit, and based upon the sovereignty of a people who do not answer to the same crown or the answer to the same authority system. And like that, this is a pretty big one, right? But there's something where you get the issues as far apart as, wars fought over resources, this Promethean planning for the future, acquiring the resources for future technology, and then going all the way down to the past of, like, who are the people of the land, what are the actual treaties for the land, and that if you're trying to use resources as a bargaining chip in some big sort of geopolitical power game, then if you don't have the indigenous people on your side, do you have any power at all? And where does the actual, if you want, like, if you, what happens if you're like, we're going to, like, use our access to this vital, valuable resource as our power to protest or to have some sort of leverage. What happens if the indigenous people just lay claim to that and take away your power from you because you never signed the treaty? And then does it become a situation of brute violence and domination and oppression over a population that does not consensually just give themselves over to you, that you get to use, you get to claim certain land and resources as your backup in the big power game? And then like if you, and then there's, you know what I'm trying to say? And then out of all this conversation, we get things like other issues that I haven't even got to, such as like, Donald Trump crashing the American dollar and then putting all this energy into making meme coins, which maybe, there's this kind of Uranus volatility of like, are you creating a kind of unstable ground for, you can see Uranus going into Gemini, and of course Donald Trump, the Gemini sun. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the Trump situation once we have Uranus in Gemini later this year, right? Okay, so I'm going to. All right, actually, you know what? I'm going to edit this together. I've got another basic idea here, which is that the whole thing about, again, it's better not to make Uranus into the planet that represents right-wing libertarianism, and Neptune the planet that represents a kind of idealistic, kind of utopian socialism or communism, right? And part of the reason I think, again, I've been reading this book recently, which I basically got from watching Joshua Citarella's Doomscroll, or Joshua Citarella on the J-Reg Horseshoe show or whatever. This is called The People's Republic of Walmart, and it's all about planned economies. It was interesting because it's the idea of a lot of the principle of right-wing, what you might call, I don't even know if libertarian makes much sense, because it's talking about libertarianism from the point of view of like a corporation, like as if a big mining corporation, right? Like what if you had, can you imagine this? Like you had a big mining corporation and its freedoms were defined on whether or not it was free to just dump toxic waste in the water supply or not, or that if you had to, like, if it was under some sort of authoritarian control to make sure that it didn't pollute, right? Like, to me, that doesn't seem like, or you could actually apply that to an individual as well, because let's say some individual person, let's say you're a farmer or something like that, and you have a bunch of like waste product or something like that that you have to dispose of, and you don't want to poison the water supply with E. coli or something like that. So there's some certain protocols or rules or something like that that govern your disposal of certain materials, or to make sure everything is done in a safe way up to code or something like that. Like same thing if you're going to build like if you want to build something and you have to like make sure you have the permits first, right? There's all these kinds of principles that would be, if the question about this, about libertarianism in this sort of context, is that if you define it okay, I think building permits is maybe more neutral, right? Because if you're talking about the freedom to just pollute things or something like that, that's more there's obviously a kind of like you're doing something wrong there. But if you want, let's say you just had you wanted to build something on your property and you have to get a permit to do it first, right? That's more neutral, because I don't think it doesn't necessarily imply you're building something for shady purposes, or you're trying to rip off people, or you know what I mean? Like there's something where it's a kind of a morally neutral situation. You're not just trying to exploit the environment. You're not ruining the freshwater resources for the future generations or anything like that. You're just building something, right? Now, if you look at it from this point of view, you have to have a basic assumption to begin with, in that you you're not probably going to get the idea to build something and follow through on it unless you are the one that owns the land in which to build something on, right? Otherwise, maybe you could just invent like an architectural style, like a blueprint that somebody else could build on their land if they so choose. But, you know, we're talking here about actually having the access to the place where the stuff is actually going to be built, not just sketching up an idea, not just sketching up, you're actually going to do it, right? And in order to do that, you need the land, first of all, and you need to have the right to the land, and you need to have the right to do what you want with the land. And in order to do that, you need to negotiate with a government authority. But there's this kind of, you don't want to have a bunch of people that are just like, it's my land, I can do what I want with it, regardless, without having some sort of state authority oversee that, right? Or this in the context of the idea of the free market or something like that, right? That this idea in this book, they talk about Walmart and about how Walmart has or some of these corporations are basically like bigger economies than, like whole communist states, right? And that inside the way that these things work, they're actually not, when you have these big corporations trying to run like a free market, they actually don't do very well. That they're giving an example of, like, here in Canada, we had recently the Hudson's Bay Company went bankrupt, but long before that we had, you know, Sears and Eatons and all that kind of stuff. Basically, in this book, one of the things they argue is that one of the reasons why Walmart is successful is that they actually have more of a central planning to their economy rather than having this sort of chaotic free market system, right? And Uranus has been, I feel like people always think about Uranus as a sort of chaotic free market libertarian kind of planet. And when it could very well be that if you think about it in terms of, let's say, the communist revolution, there was this chapter that I'm reading here near the end of the book where it is a bit of a bummer, obviously, because we all know that communist Russia did not go very well with Stalinism and all this kind of thing. Part of the problem with that was because, most of the people in the Soviet Union were poor peasants, right? And my own ancestors, as I mentioned in the previous part of this video, my own ancestors were poor peasants that ended up leaving communist Russia, basically, or the Soviet Union, for freedom in Canada. And the problem about this was that the original Marxist idea for communism was supposed to be that once the industrial culture developed to a certain degree, then that would create the right conditions for communism. But the problem with Russia is that they did it after. They got in the wrong order. You had a bunch of poor peasants that weren't industrialized, who had a revolution, and then decided to industrialize after the fact. And it didn't go very well, unfortunately. And a lot of them decided just to get the hell out of there, come to Canada, and then the offspring of these poor peasants were quickly went through a period of rapid class mobility and basically became the bourgeois. But the reason why this happened was because in the war period, all of these people trained to be soldiers, and basically in the post-war period, you don't want to have a bunch of people who are like heavily armed, proficient killers who are like, this is our land, and if you don't like it, this is what my grandpa was like. I mean, he was kind of crazy like that, right? He was a military dude and so there was a kind of thing where he was given an education to encourage him to become a civilized lawyer, a kind of a bourgeois, holder of status and privilege in society, so that he wasn't just like a crazed maniac with a gun that was going to like throw a revolution or something like that, right? This is basically, so the bourgeois are created as a kind of a class of like civilized people who, are like, we want to do things the civilized way. We want a democracy. We don't want to like do all our negotiations at the end of a gun barrel, basically. And so this, basically you have people who spent generations and generations and generations being poor peasants, a brief period of time of intense military conflict, and then the creation of a new bourgeois society out of a kind of a post-revolutionary world of privilege and affluence for white culture, basically, right? And then here I come, right, to make astrology videos. So the idea is that in the midst of all of this, rewind back to communism and the idea of industrialization in a post-revolutionary communist country, is that there were a lot of problems that people had to solve in terms of making it work for supply chain management, basically making sure that the economy worked, that people produced the right amount of food, clothing, shelter, the industry, everything was giving people what they needed. And unfortunately, with all of this, is that the Stalinists and the Maoists got a bad reputation because there were mass famines, there was mass authoritarian crackdown, and it is a drag. And but the thing is, what I'm trying to say about all this is that, and I have to admit, my own reason of my own family's story is wrapped up in the peasants who fled from this, right, and then who became a bunch of like soldiers, and then who became the bourgeois, right? Or I don't know, I don't know if I'm rich enough to be considered bourgeois, but that's the idea, right? Like instead of being a peasant or instead of being a soldier, I come from a family who's been encouraged to become, like doctors and lawyers and the kind of middle upper class, and not to not to not rather than violent revolution, to do things in a civilized kind of legal way, right? Have a kind of a mature logical, legalistic way of thinking about things, right? And the idea of technological change and technological disruption in capitalism, that is seen as something which takes the established way of doing things and shakes it up, right? In the sense that, like, you had your ancestors being like peasants or something like that for years and years and years. And capitalism comes along and introduces industrialization, which just like and the funny thing about this is that my own family, the closest we ever got to this was my mother going to university to learn about like managing agriculture at an industrial scale and working in the government, as rather than working in the field as a peasant, working in the government at the governmental level, doing all this like supply chain management stuff. Like that is kind of like the evolution of peasants into a socialist state, agrarian industrial culture, right? And then the idea that if we have if we have as a nation a national unity, rather than all these splinter factions wanting to separate, then we can have a coherent strategy using the real resources that we have in a coherent plan to be strong in a sort of solidarity as a nation, right? That's one way you could take it. National solidarity to stand up to American imperialism with Canadian sovereignty, with clever a civilized approach by having a clever understanding of numbers and supply chain issues and making that work, rather than having a chaotic free market system. And I'll give you an example of this with for example, the Canadian milk industry, is that we have actually a pretty good dairy industry, in the sense that our meat and dairy industry, we have high standards for not having cows on antibiotics or on hormone drugs or something like that. To have a more natural or an organic kind of dairy and cattle and beef industry by default, right? Due to our legislation, due to our authoritarian regime, it actually makes our dairy and beef industry better. And Americans are frustrated by this because we have these limits that don't let Americans sell us their substandard product, which is laden with all kinds of hormonal their cows are jacked up on all kinds of hormones to make them produce more milk and stuff, and they're in these terrible factory farm things, and they have to have antibiotics. We have. I'm not saying we're perfect in Canada. You know, maybe we have our rooms for improvement, but we are at basically better. And the last time Donald Trump was in office, he was aggressively trying to push American products into the Canadian market. We eventually even gave in and appeased him to the extent where you could go to the grocery store and suddenly see American brands of dairy. But the thing was that the Canadian buyers know that their product is better, and we end up boycotting the American product, so that even if you did send us stuff, we wouldn't buy it, right? Even we would pay more for the better Canadian product, right? And this is not because the Canadian product it's actually that you get a worse product from this completely chaotic, disruptive, libertarian, free market system that the Americans are apparently so fond of, right? And there's this is a bit of a ramble, I have to say, but there's another idea that I've gotten off track of here, which is the if you go back to communism, and at some point in time you had to have these guys in the system inventing different, like, it's kind of complicated. It's pretty dry in this book, but you could be a guy in a communist system, and you have to solve some sort of supply chain management issue, and the thing is, these people nobody knows about these guys. These guys created the structure for how we do things today, but nobody knows about it because they're just some nameless bureaucrat solving some problem in some sort of government office. And yet, but we have this sort of idea that every time somebody comes up with a new idea or a new way of doing things, it's because they are like a free market individual who's thinking outside. They're not being weighed down by the authoritarian regime. They're thinking outside the box. They're having a little entrepreneur Kickstarter, and they're like shaking it up from the outside and disrupting the cumbersome state. And but it's actually, if you actually go into the the communist regime, you may have people coming up with all kinds of solutions, coming up with all kinds of inventions in that other system that end up getting carried over, or that could apply if you're like Walmart or something like that. That instead of having a free market internal system within your big mega corporation, it's like a good example of this could be distribution, where you have the warehouse, the distribution warehouse, and the store that orders the products. What if they're owned by the same company? To the extent where it's not like you being in a free market relationship. I am the guy who owns the store, you're the guy who owns the warehouse, we buy and sell things between each other. What if that is together as a unified system, so there's no market exchange between them, but rather, like, if the guy at the store needs things, we send it to them, and we just try to do that as efficiently as possible, and we realize that having multiple stores and multiple warehouses competing with each other actually makes it more cumbersome and more inefficient, basically, right? I don't know. So I almost forgot to put this in here, so I'm just gonna edit this in at the end. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more.